Right, so I seen this yesterday from the LA Times, and the minute I seen it, I knew I had to make a video on it because this whole issue with this kind of stuff is a huge issue nowadays, and it needs to be talked about more. So basically, LA Times put out a story yesterday, and I mean, just for starters, too, LA Times is not a right wing publication. I mean, I wouldn't say they're far left, but they're definitely left. I mean, they're in an area that's overwhelmingly left. So the fact that they're so successful, I mean, you have to be on the left, even if you want to argue that they're not biased, they're still left. So this is by no means a biased point of view or anything. And basically, it's titled "California's Changing Demographics Will Further Doom Republicans." And the first thing that I would point out too is that it's not just California. It's just happening in California faster than the rest of the country and the rest of the West. And for all the Canadians out there watching this is the same thing is happening here in Canada too. Um, Third world immigration to Canada it's higher as a percent of the population, or when you adjust for population size, than it is for the U.S. I believe the U.S. you have about, I mean, illegal immigration, you got about a million, I think just over a million people on pace for this year, and then legal I think is it's pretty low. In Canada we have about, I think we're doing 350,000 in the US. So I mean, for the only way that for it to even out between, I mean, illegal immigration in Canada too, it's probably upwards of 400, between 350 400. So when you adjust for population, that's about the equivalent to about 4 million people coming into the US. And there's about a million people, and that's overwhelming the system. So basically, but the point I wanted to get to in this video is that anybody who talks about demographics and voting is immediately vilified as a racist. I know at the forefront of this you have Stefan Molyneux, who's called a racist because of it, even though it's completely true, it's completely factual, there's nothing factually wrong about it. So calling him a racist for pointing it out is just asinine. It's insane because facts can't be racist. Like I said before, and I'll say it a million times over because way too many people still don't understand this. Judging groups differently when they act differently is not racist or prejudiced in any way. It's only racist or prejudiced when they act the same. So being someone who's on the right and saying, well, I don't want mass immigration because that means more people who go against my own self-interest and my own group's self-interest is not racist. It would only be racist if they don't act any differently than your own group, your own in-group, which they act very differently. Um, like I said, immigrants from the third world are about twice as likely to be on one or more forms of welfare in the U.S. That's a fact. I've made videos about that. I'm going to continue making videos about that because not enough people understand that. And so saying, well, being someone on the right, you're generally someone who pays taxes. You're generally someone who's, upper middle class, which means someone coming in who's a group of people coming in who overwhelmingly are going to be on welfare just means that either your taxes are going to have to be raised to offset that, or you're going to have to go further into debt. And further into debt means less investment in your country. It means, I mean, going further into debt, it generally means a future tax increase because you can either raise taxes now or raise taxes later. And people who don't pay taxes, namely people on the left or people who pay little to no taxes, they don't care about that. And that's why the left, it's almost impossible having a conversation with people on the left about this kind of stuff because they they can't see, they can't imagine things outside of their own worldview. And I've made a video about this before, so anyone questioning this, I can refer you to that video. I don't remember exactly what it's titled, but I made it about 3 or 4 months ago. And it was a study done, and it found that people on the right can predict people in the. They basically told people, they told, they basically figured out where people lie politically. They gave them a compass test, and then they went back and told them to, okay, let's do another one, but answer it how you think someone. If you're on the right, answer it how you think someone on the left would answer, and if you're on the left, answer it how you think someone on the right would answer. And they found that people on the right could answer very accurately how people on the left answer tests. and they found that people on the left weren't very good at answering how people on the right answered them. And that's for the simple reason that to be on the left, you have to assume malice, right? Because if you don't, then you're completely morally wrong in every way, shape, or form. And we know that all those the whole malice and racist, sexist, homophobe, whatever you want to call it, these reasons why people on the left are against people on the right. They always have to assume some sort of malice, or there's this evil conniving person who's got this horrible sinister agenda to do. And people on the right don't have to do that. All they have to do is, number one, make the arguments. And that's the other thing too, is that the left can't make coherent arguments, because how do you make a coherent argument against something like this? It's just basic demographics that people from countries where the IQ is below average tend to vote left. It's very simple. There's been tons of studies done on this stuff. It's not arguable. And which is why people on the right if they want immigration, they want it from countries, the European countries usually. And that's because they want people who are more like them. And that's the same reason why the left wants immigration from the third world. Number one, the main reason is that they can't win elections as is. Canada, they won, but that's because, immigration's been really high for the last 3 or 4 years, even basically since Trudeau came in. And it was even very high under the Harper years, contrary to popular opinion. It was, I think, 250,000 the year Harper left office, which is, again, that'd be the equivalent to about 2.5, 3 million people coming into the U.S., which is, I'm almost certain that the U.S. numbers, it's just over 1 million, I believe. But a lot of those are illegal, so it's hard to know exactly, because if they're coming across the border illegally, well, you're just estimating, so it's hard. But a lot of the Canadian ones are coming across illegally as well, so it's still hard. But basically, the point I wanted to get at in this video is that people who point this kind of stuff out are always vilified as racists and whatever is you want to call it, and yet you have people on the left who are admitting it. That's the one thing that bothers me a lot about people on the left, that people they always ask, well, what can we do to get along, and what can we do to find common ground, all this kind of stuff. And the first thing is to just be honest. Like the left, the problem with them is that they're never honest. They're honest about some things, don't get me wrong, but stuff like this, they're never honest, because they claim to care so much about the poor. Well, look at San Francisco and Los Angeles. Poverty and homelessness is a massive problem, and yet there's literally Democrats at every level of government. If Democrats could solve the problem, they would have done it long ago. So they don't care about the poor. They claim to care about the poor to get elected, because their ideas are so bad that they have to lie to people. Again, this kind of stuff. They call you racist even though it's a fact. Like, facts cannot be racist, right? It cannot be racist if it's a fact. It cannot be racist if groups of people act differently. And here you have it. You have LA Times, a left-wing publication. Not that we needed this. This is just more evidence on top of the pile of evidence 10 feet high that already proved it. But the other problem too with people on the left is that there's nothing that, like, you could ask them, and they'll probably give you some BS answer, but you could ask them, well, what would it take for you to agree with me on the subject? And one of their answers would have to be, well, people on the left acknowledging the issue, or acknowledging the fact that you're pointing out. And here we have it. And yet I guarantee you that if you asked 1,000 people who want this mass immigration, maybe one, maybe two of them would change their mind on the topic and be like, yeah, you know what, you're right. And that's the problem we have nowadays, is that there's nothing you can tell people to get them to agree with you, or to even not to agree with you, but to even consider changing their mind on the topic. And that's one of the things that when you're going into a debate with people, that's one of the first things that you should ask them, well, what would it take for you to change your mind or consider changing your mind? And if you're right about whatever you're debating, which namely this issue, it would be, well, number one, can you show me the data that proves that people vote differently? Which, it's obvious. The left constantly points out how they'll point out that Donald Trump got such a low percentage of the black and Hispanic vote, but yet they'll never point out that he got such a low percentage of the white vote. So the left is completely on board with this kind of stuff. They're just not open to it because if and the reason people it might boggle people's mind to, well, why aren't they open about this kind of stuff? Why don't they acknowledge it? Well, it's very simple that if they acknowledge it, then they have to acknowledge that the only reason that they want it is not because they care about the poor. It's because they're having trouble winning elections, and if they bring in people that vote for them at a rate of 75-80%, well, that's, if you bring in 1 million people, well, that's an extra 250, I mean, not right here and now, but down the road, that's an extra 250,000 people that are going to vote for you. And if you do that every year, well, after 10 years, that's 2.5 million people, right? So obviously, like I said, it would take time. It's not immediate, but a lot of illegals do vote immediately. A lot of them get driver. I mean, California, you don't have to be a citizen to get a driver's license, which means you can vote as long as you do that. I mean, a lot of states don't even require a driver's license, so it's a little different in Canada. It's a little harder to vote illegally, which it was done in a pretty good amount last election. From what I could hear, I heard of a ton of people who weren't citizens that got voter cards. In the U.S., you don't even need a driver's license in a lot of states, especially a lot of the big leftist states, namely California, to vote. So there's very little that's done to help prevent illegal voting. So that's another issue in and of itself. But basically, what I wanted to get at in this video is that people like me, like Stefan Molyneux, like tons of other people, have been pointing this kind of stuff out. I mean, me, I've just been making videos for less than a year, but other people for literally like 10 years. And they've always been vilified as racist, as whatever you want to call it, aside from racist. And yet, it's a fact. Like, you have left-wing publications literally admitting that it's the case. And the big problem with it, like I said too, is that the left needs to constantly have this idea that the only reason that people disagree with them is that they have nefarious intentions. And the reason why they always come up with those accusations is because they don't have nefarious intentions. But if they don't have nefarious intentions, well, then that would get people to maybe think, oh, maybe they're not so bad. Maybe they do have good intentions. And if they don't have nefarious intentions, and we've been accusing them of having nefarious intentions for decades now, well, that anyone would look at that and be like, yeah, you guys have been lying to us all along. It's more than likely you that's been doing that. And that's why they don't want to acknowledge this kind of stuff. So I don't want to talk about this issue too much more, but like I said, this is a massive issue. For anyone on the right, if you're not talking about this kind of stuff, well, you won't be able to talk about it soon, because if immigration is kept at the levels that it is in Canada and the US for much longer, you're never going to see a right-wing government elected again. To be honest, in Canada, I would bet on one never being elected again at this point. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be a quote-unquote conservative government elected, but I mean, the sheer government was as far to the left as a conservative government has ever been, and it wasn't even close. Like, I mean, the sheer conservatives, they could have ran as liberals like 10, 20 years ago, and no one really would have questioned it. So, basically, like I said, I don't think a truly conservative government will be elected in Canada again. The U.S. is a little different because there is the media is a little bit different. Like in Canada, we're literally just left-wing media. Like that's all you got. So the brainwashing's worse in Canada. The immigration's higher in Canada. The U.S., at least they have somewhat of a check on it. In Canada, we don't really deport people who come in illegally. In fact, we're welcoming with open arms. The U.S. is, depending on where you are, I mean, at a federal level, the Trump government is trying to deport as many as they can, from what I've heard. But it's different because in the U.S. you have your sanctuary states and cities, and in Canada we have that too, to an extent, but it's different here because the laws are different. But yeah, like I said, that if we don't get a handle, and for people who are moderates too, like the one thing that bothers me about moderates is they always refuse to take a position on the really important stuff. Like moderates, they'll take a strong position on like their foreign policy or their policy on gay marriage or on marijuana legalization, but yet they'll refuse to take a policy stance on something like this, or on the tax rate, or anything that's in my mind big. Not that foreign policy or gay marriage or anything that like that is irrelevant. It's still an issue, but it's an issue that, number one, I mean, foreign policy doesn't directly affect us, and I think the majority of the public agrees on foreign policy. It's just the big neocon and neoliberal um, politicians that want the war. It's the majority of people on both sides don't even want the war, so it's not really the electorate that's the problem with that. I mean, I don't know of. I think gay marriage is pretty much a settled thing nowadays. I don't think there's too many people that are against it. There's a lot of people that are against the over the top nature of it and the teaching little kids about it kind of stuff, which I definitely am. But the problem is that they lump all that stuff together. But I've made this video pretty long, so I don't want to go too much further. But long story short, this stuff needs to be talked about. It's not racist. It's not any ist or ism. It's a fact, and people on the left and the right acknowledge it. You even, like I said, you have a left-wing outlet acknowledging it. So stop, for the love of God, calling people racist for pointing this kind of stuff out, because it's not. It would only be if you could prove that immigrants from the third world voted Republican or conservative at the same rate, which they don't. And if they voted conservative, if they were more likely to vote conservative, would the left honestly, or more likely to vote Republican, would the left honestly want it? Like, are you honestly saying that you're going to want that you're having a lot of trouble winning elections, but you want to bring in people who are going to shift who are going to make it more likely for a right-wing government to be elected? Like, don't BS. Like, you're just lying if you're saying that. So I'll leave it there. If you like the video, make sure to hit that like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.